Okay, gang, if you've been following along with my video series so far, we have already talked about using brushes. We've already talked about using the basic shape tools, messing with the color palette, and all of the essential functions for starting a new document, exporting, and so forth. So one thing people have been requesting a lot is how to use the pen tool, which is arguably one of the more flexible tools in the system. And for this series of videos, I'm going to specifically not be using a tablet as an input. I think you don't always have access to these, so it's really good to know how to make illustrations when all you've got is just a basic setup of the computer and the mouse. And the pen tool, while it's probably got the steepest learning curve of anything you'll find in Illustrator, once you learn it, you'll see that it applies to all sorts of different programs. So the pen tool is crucial in Photoshop, just like it is in Illustrator. But you'll also see it for controlling, say, keyframing when it comes to animations in Premiere. I'm sure it's found in Cinema 4D and those kinds of programs, even though I'm less familiar with those. It used to be really important in Flash, which basically doesn't exist anymore. It's all over the place. So you'll be happy you learned it, even if you decide never to use Illustrator again. Okay, so for this example, I'm going to start once again from an image. I have an image here, skull.jpg, and I'll drag that down into Illustrator and open it up. Doesn't really matter where that thing sits, but I do want to go ahead and lock it. And then once I've done that, I create a new layer, and I like to call this layer, Illo or Art or something like that. So right now I can't accidentally move my skull. And then my illustration layer is the active one, and that's where my new art is going to land. Okay, so Z on the keyboard, and then click a couple times to zoom in. And let's get nice and close. And we're going to start out by creating an edge on this thing. I'll hit P for pen, so the pen tool is right here. Not to be confused with the curvature tool, so ignore those for now. And if I hold down my mouse, I can do what's known as tearing out the menu. So I can let this thing sit right here and always get access to it without going through as many steps. Another crucial one's going to be holding down the space bar so that I get my little pan hand, and that's going to help me move the image around as I do the curvature of the skull. So a couple ways to enter into this when you're using the pen tool. Often when people are getting started, I recommend to them that they just start with single clicks. And so you're looking for places where the curve changes direction. So if you imagine, say, waves in the ocean, you might make a click every time the wave is at its highest and every time the trough of the wave is at its lowest, if you can sort of imagine that. So I might go click, click, and so forth. And you'll see that right now my line is not doing a very accurate job of depicting the edge of the skull, but that's because there's no curvature information so far. So let's get out to here. And then I'm going to hit Escape. And then I'll come in with this funky little tool called the Convert Point tool. Well, it's called that in Photoshop here. It's called the Anchor Point tool. And it looks like a little caret. So as I hover over something that does not currently have curvature information, which is what happens when I single click the mouse with the pen tool, I can hold down the mouse and then drag this thing to the side. And you'll see that now the skull, or the line that I'm using to define the skull, starts to develop curvature information. And that curvature information is abstracted and represented by this thing right here called a tangency handle. So let's take a moment and talk about the terms in this system here. So the point right there at the center is known as the anchor point. This little bar that stretches out here is known as the tangency handle, and by default it'll have that 180-degree relationship on either side of the anchor. So there's three things that I can change when I start talking about anchor points that have curvature information. And the first of those things is just the location of the anchor point. This I would do with the white arrow. You see how if I get really close to this thing and take a hard look at it, right there my anchor point is filled in a solid color, whereas the rest of these anchors are white on the interior. So that means just my anchor is selected, and now I can safely kind of move it around. And you'll see the cool thing about this is that the tangency handle and the location of the anchor will update that curve based on the changes to these variables. The other thing I can start to do is to actually change the angle of the tangency handle relative to the center, and then I can also change the magnitude or the length of the tangency handle. So that affects how strongly that curve information is imparted. So you can see here, even though I still have a 180-degree relationship. Now this tangency handle on this side is longer than it is on that side, which allows very few points to represent a fairly complicated curve off the top of this skull. I'm also going to take the opportunity to make this thing transparent so we can really see what we're doing. And maybe I'll make my line, say, bright red, and then I might bump the stroke up a little bit in thickness so we can really tell what's going on. Okay, so that's the basics to get you started, and it's a lot of information, so let's pause and then we'll pick up here in the next video.